The dollop family were one of the great noble houses of Tudor England, who awkwardly possessed a big dollop of York royal blood, tracing direct descent from Elizabeth of York, a sister of Kings Edward IV and Richard III. They were therefore cousins to the other major claimants for the throne, including their namesakes, the Pole family, headed by Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. It would be the dollop family whom Richard III intended to be his successors following the death of his son, and this family would in turn become figureheads of rebellion against the Tudors. Today I am pleased to welcome historian and author Richard Anderton onto the podcast for the first time for a discussion based on his latest book, The Last Yorkists, Edmund and Richard de la Pole. We discuss these two brothers' lives, early days, their connections to the other noble houses, their roles in rebellion against the Tudors, and of course, how this would inevitably lead to their destruction. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 115, The Last Yorkists, Edmund and Richard de la Pole with Richard Anderton. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Richard Anderton. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for asking me to join in.
Very welcome. You're here to talk about your upcoming book, The Last Yorkists, Edmund and Richard de la Pole. When is the book coming out? Is it imminent?
No, it's out now.
It's out now already?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, out on September 15th. So yes, it should be available. I know it's in most Waterstones and the usual online retailers and all good independent bookshops, I would hope.
Wonderful. Well, before we get into the conversation about these two fascinating men and this window of Tudor history that is very seldom explored, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what it is that you do full time?
I was born and bred in the north of England, so I've moved around between Lancashire, Yorkshire and Northumberland, and so always north of the Humber, and full-time writer. Have been for, 25 years now, I think. Started out working in as a freelance for magazines and, commercial writing, basically anything that paid the electricity bills. And but I've gone into books in the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm now doing books full time. Which is obviously history has always been my first love. So history titles were a logical step for me.
Lovely. What part of Yorkshire did you live in? Near
Wakefield. I was actually, my parents had a little house just round the corner from Richard, Duke of York's castle at Sandal. So in the Battle of Wakefield, with the name Richard and a connection to Wakefield, that then one obviously was interested in the White Rose.
Well, I ask because I'm half Yorkshire myself. So, I'm born and bred in the south, but my dad's a Yorkshireman. He's from Batley.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah, and my grandmother is still there now. She turned 102 last week.
Good gracious, congratulations.
I know. Wow. Wait, to put her age into perspective, I remember when she turned 100 and she got her birthday card from the King. I said to her, You do realise that he's your fifth monarch?
That's brilliant, yes.
That's mad though, isn't it? When you consider, when you put that into perspective, you go, fucking hell, that is how old she is. This is her fifth monarch, and for everyone else, it's our second, probably.
Yeah. And considering obviously Queen Elizabeth was on the throne for many decades, wow, that just, as you say, just proves the longevity. That's amazing.
Yeah, it really does. So if you had the opportunity to jump in a time travel machine and you can witness a single moment from history, what would you choose?
Well, I think it probably would be the Battle of Pavia, which is the battle. It was Richard's last battle, without giving away too many spoilers. But it was fought in 1525. It was part of the Italian War. wars, and it was part of this very long struggle between France, the Holy Roman Empire, for control of Milan. And Richard found himself sort of caught up in this maelstrom, and it's one of the first battles where firearms, handheld firearms rather than cannon and siege artillery, became important. And it was a complete rout of the French in the end. Richard was actually fighting for the French in an odd twist of fate. Because his ancestors fought against the French at Agincourt. So what he thought he was doing with it. But yes, it's all part of his long-term goal to try and persuade the kings of France to back a Yorkist restoration. And sadly, it was not to be.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the book. As I say, you've written this book that's now out, The Last Yorkists, Edmund and Richard de la Pole. So firstly, can you introduce the de la Pole family for me? Who were they and what was their link? How were they part of the York royal family?
The first William Pole that we know of was not quite sure where, but either Hull or Ravenspur, which is the lost town on the Humber estuary, and they were all merchants, and they appear in the late 1200s. Sir William de la Pole started lending money to the crown, and he turned his wool fortune, which was large, into an extremely large fortune by lending all this cash, and he financed the campaigns of Edward I, and his son carried on this tradition of money lending to the crown. And somewhere along the line, they added the de la to make themselves more aristocratic. This is where the de la Poles actually really begin their connection with the Wars of the Roses. And they start out as Lancastrians. In a last attempt to cling to power, William de la Pole marries his young son, who's John de la Pole, and he marries her to Margaret Beaufort, the very same Margaret Beaufort who ends up being the mother of Henry VII. But of course, I mean, they're both children. So when they are married, they're betrothed when they were little more than babies. And they were married when they were under 5. And this was too much even for the medieval period. And that marriage was quickly annulled. And then after William's fall, the de la Poles were out in the wilderness, and that they rescued by John's mother, who's Alice Chaucer, and she's the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, Canterbury Tales and all that. And she sort of sees which way the wind is going. By this time, the Yorkists are Richard of York is in the ascendancy, and Henry VI and the Lancastrian regime is in crisis. And she marries John to the daughter of Richard of York, who's Elizabeth of York. And when William dies, John becomes Duke of Suffolk, and Elizabeth is the Duchess of Suffolk. And so literally in the space of one marriage, they've transferred from Lancaster to York. And they now become thoroughly attached to the Yorkist party. And of course, whilst the Yorkists are in ascendancy, this is all well and good. And but as you well know, it was a roller coaster ride, shall we say? Okay, so they are married into the York family by marriage to Elizabeth of York, not to be confused with the other Elizabeth of York we're talking about Elizabeth of York, the sister of the man who becomes Edward IV, the man who becomes Richard III, and obviously George, Duke of Clarence as well. So her sons, Edmund and Richard, are the nephews, albeit in the female line, of two of England's kings. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Precisely. And this is where the link to all of these Margaret people Pole, are cousins. So how does because of course John de la Pole, Clarence, so their Edmund and Richard's eldest brother, how does he actually eventually emerge as the wider York family's premier claimant to the throne during the reign of Henry VII, who dies or has to be removed to clear this path so that the eldest son of a daughter of the House of York is suddenly the most potent claimant? Yeah, I mean, obviously, I want to sidestep the whole Princes in the Tower, but I think it's safe to say that Richard III he manages to sideline most of his paternal nephews through titular regis and the various acts of Parliament. You know, obviously Clarence's son, Margaret Pole's brother, Earl of Warwick, he's barred from the Act of Attainder, his father, and Edward V and his brother Richard Shrewsbury, they of course are removed from the throne because of their father's alleged bigamy. So he's sidelined the male paternal cousins. So, but that leaves the female paternal cousins, which are of course the de la Poles. And the problem for Richard III is his own son dies, and who's known as Edward of Middleton, I believe. And so that was his only legitimate child, and so he's left without an heir. And of course, you know, if he wants to continue the Yorkist dynasty, he needs an heir. So he turns to the de la Poles, his nephews by his sister. And though John de la Pole is never officially appointed Prince of Wales or anything like that, he is given certain offices that are normally given to the heir to the throne. So he's made president of the Council of the North, which Edward of Middleham had held, and Lord of Ireland, which Richard III had been, and also the de la Pole girls feature, because John and Elizabeth had 11 children, and so one of them, Anne, Richard III plans to marry to the heir to the throne of Scotland to sort of, you know, cement that alliance. And so the de la Poles become very, very important to Richard.
Yeah, it's almost like Richard is looking at the de la Poles as
and marriage
these are my
backup
sort of royal family.
And but of course Bosworth interferes with all these plans.
Yeah, and it's such a funny one, isn't it, with Edward of Warwick as well? Because as I mentioned to you earlier,
come off the bench,
I wrote a book about Margaret and her family, and all being equal. Well, firstly, Edward Earl of Warwick was actually had a greater claim to the throne than Richard himself, if we follow primogeniture. And I concluded in my take on the whole thing that really George Duke of Clarence's attainder, there was no basis in law for that attainder touching his children's right to the throne. That was it, Richard using the law to sweep away a more potent claimant. I don't believe that actually it was particularly legal, really, which will then, I suppose, is then why, because Edmund and Richard are via a sister, that makes them, yes, clear claimants to the throne, but maybe not as potent. They're not more of a claimant than Richard in the way that Edward Earl of Warwick was, if that makes sense. Mm.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So obviously the female line becomes incredibly important to royal families across Europe, and you know what was going on in with the Burgundian inheritance, for example. You know, that was supposed to devolve to the Holy Roman Emperor through his daughter.
To this end,
but
is Henry VII, who's on the throne, is he mistrustful of the de la Pole men from the outset of his reign, would you say?
Well, I mean, initially, you know, Henry VII is very good at mending fences, to coin a phrase, and you know, a lot of sort of Yorkists, like the de la Poles, seem to have taken. You were at the coronation; they performed the ceremonial acts and carried scepters and things, and swore the oaths, and everything seems tickety boo. It's odd that John de la Pole decides to rebel, and of course he does become involved in the whole Lambert Simnel affair, and you know, again, as I'm sure you know, this was the young boy who was groomed by unscrupulous priests to impersonate the Earl of Warwick, who was, you know, now in the Tower, and I'm sure John, you know, having had a taste of royalty, and I think that there's a seal somewhere from John de la Pole, which, you know, where he's basically I can't remember the exact details, but he's saying, I'm next in line to the throne. Hear my words and weep, and so he definitely feels that he's got a good shot at this. Now, of course, he doesn't actually come out as a claimant to the throne by supporting Simnel. He simply arranges and joins a pre-existing rebellion, and whether he would have ousted Simnel at a later date, is a matter of conjecture. But certainly, it's John de la Pole who goes to his aunt, Margaret, who I hinted at. She'd married into Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and when he died, she became a wealthy heiress. So she had the money and the political clout to back these invasion plans. And that's exactly where John de la Pole went, and he got the wherewithal to equip Simnel, who was in Ireland, and they launched the campaign that ended at the Battle of Stoke Field.
Yes, and John is killed. He dies. With his death, Edmund, his younger brother, but next eldest, it becomes the chief representative of the de la Pole family, and he's also takes the title of Duke of Suffolk in 1492. At this stage, at least,
Yes.
What roles is Edmund performing under Henry VII? I mean, he's present at the siege of Boulogne, so that would suggest that, for all intents and purposes, he was being loyal to the Tudors at this stage.
Absolutely. And again, the pattern seems to repeat itself with John. Initially, Edmund shows no inclination that he wants to be a rebel or to be king or anything like that. And he is a member of the Tudor court. And obviously there's the old adage of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But there are sort of receipts where Edmund has organised parties for the king, and in the royal accounts, there's payments for using the Duke of Suffolk's minstrels and this sort of thing at various masks and disguisings, and he's a very keen jouster. He takes parts in jousts, and so he just performs the usual role that a not very clever courtier would do. So he seems to be no threat at all. And the siege of Boulogne, again, is very indicative of Henry's reign, I think, because that was conducted to stop the King of France from supporting the other famous pretender from Henry VII, and that's Perkin Warbeck, who was claiming that he was the younger of the princes in the Tower, Richard of Shrewsbury.
Yeah.
And so Henry, basically, this is a punitive raid. You can't even call it a war, because he besieges Boulogne and, basically demands the French, stop supporting Warbeck. And apparently there was very little fighting at the siege, and there's only one English casualty, and that was John Savage, I think, who was ambushed on a reconnaissance mission. But Edmund is definitely there, and again, I think this is Henry having a show of force and a show of unity against the French by taking all the leading nobles of the day, including the chief Yorkist, to Boulogne to say, we are a united front. Warbeck is nothing to us. Stop. And the King of France does. And he not only stops, he pays Henry a whacking great pension for several years afterwards. And Warbeck then goes to Margaret of Burgundy and repeats the Simnel pattern all over again. So, Edmund at this stage is a minor member of the royal court, even though he has this royal blood in his veins.
And whilst this is all going on, what is Richard, his younger brother, doing at this stage?
So, of course, Richard is quite a bit younger. We don't know exactly when he was born, but he was probably born about 1480, sometime around then. So for example, at the siege of Boulogne, he would have been around 12 years old.
Right, okay.
We actually know nothing about his early life. There's one of the most important court spectacles that Edmund took part in was a joust in 1494 to celebrate the elevation of the Henry VII's second son, the future Henry VIII, him being created Duke of York. And again, the title's no accident. He's saying, that the House of York is now mine, and I'm going to give it to my second son. So, and what's more, the old House of York, Edmund, he's going to take part in this, and he's going to lose all the fights. But he didn't read the script; he actually won most of them, which maybe didn't help his cause. But so Edmund, so we think there's a minor entry in an account of this joust which says that Edmund's mother and his sisters were there. So it's reasonable to assume his brothers, there's another brother as well, William, also watched him. But as I say, we have very, very little information until the 1500s.
So Henry VII strips back some of Edmund's titles. He demotes him effectively from a duke, which is the most senior title in the peerage, down to an earl. Still a nice title, but it's third in the run. So why did that happen?
Yeah, again, I think certainly Henry. Obviously, he'd lived through the latter stage of the Wars of the Roses, and he'd probably seen, the trouble that dukes caused, and even Richard III, had immense trouble with the Duke of Buckingham and this sort of thing. So there was definitely a move amongst not just Henry but all the crowned heads of Europe to try and downsize the power of their regional nobles. I mean, in France as well, this was a process that was going on apace, and so I think he was looking at any opportunity to shrink the dukedoms and keep them within the royal gift, and because again. The Dukes of Suffolk had no real aristocratic background. They'd only become dukes in 1450, so it's just a generation ago, 2 generations. So, and also it was again sending out these signals to the rest of the nobility that the House of York is not a royal house anymore. They are earls, they're not dukes. Dukes are royal, and the de la Poles are not.
Yeah.
So and. Also, it is a little bit cheeky because what you were saying about Clarence's attainder and how the legality of seizing a lot of the lands is questionable. Same thing happens with Henry. He seizes not only lands that John de la Pole lost because, of course, he was attainted because he had indeed led a rebellion. So, but he also seized wider de la Pole estates and manors. Particularly those that had ceremonial significance. There's one, Kettleswell, gosh, my brain goes, and where if you held that manor, you had the right to hold a sceptre at various royal occasions, and by taking that back into the gift of the crown, he's literally taking away the royalty from the de la Poles, but also on a very practical note, But by taking away their lands, of course, land is wealth in the Middle Ages, he's reducing their power to physically finance rebellion, let alone attract supporters to him. So it was a very clever move in many respects by Henry.
Yeah, he's neutralizing them
Exactly, yeah.
Because the thing is, he's able to easily neutralize, whether we like it or not, this is still a deeply patriarchal society. He is able to neutralize the York women in an instant by marrying them to people.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
That's what it is, With the men, it is more difficult. So I suppose this is a convenient way, short of having them beheaded, which is what eventually happens to, bless him, the little Earl of Warwick. With the other men, this is a way of neutralizing them in a way that is not going to spill blood, but serve his purpose.
Exactly, yes.
So in 1498, Edmund is involved in a brawl which ends in someone's murder, for which he is found guilty. So what on earth happened here, and what was the actual outcome of this?
So again, it's a fascinating episode. I have no proof of this, but it's all a bit too neat, and you could certainly imagine Henry sort of hiring assassins and saying, right, ambush Edmund, make it look like a drunken brawl, and your gold's waiting for you behind the shed. So the facts are that a man called Thomas Crewe and Edmund de la Pole and the various Confederates got involved in a drunken brawl in Cheapside in the east end of London, and words were said, swords were drawn, and Crewe is killed. And again, this is a godsend to Henry, because he did have this platform whereby he wanted to restore the rights of Magna Carta, which is an aspect that's not often talked about, and he wanted to uphold the rule of law. And so Crewe was a plaintiff in a court case, which didn't help Edmund's case. So Henry becomes determined to make an example of Edmund and say, look, the nobility are not above the law. He's going to be prosecuted. And of course, the fact he's a member of the House of York, it's all grist to Henry's mill. So unfortunately, there were a couple of members of Henry's court who had committed murder in similar circumstances, who did get off scot-free. So this rather pokes a hole in this policy of being the upholder of law and order. Anyway, so Edmund is said, you have to plead guilty in open court, and he's told on the quiet he will be pardoned, like the other guys had been, but they didn't have to plead in court. So Edmund agrees to this. I mean, he didn't really have much choice. But it's utterly humiliating for because he's been downgraded from Duke to Earl, and now he's stood in the dock being charged with murder like a common criminal. And so, even though he plays on for a while, but then he up sticks and he flees across the Channel. And again, why he did this, in theory it's all sorted, but this is 1498, 1499, when the Perkin Warbeck had just escaped from the Tower of London. There's a guy, Ralph Wolford, who pops up on the scene as another Yorkist pretender. Again, I think he claims to be the Earl of Warwick as well. And, Wolford's executed, Warbeck's, quickly recaptured, clapped back in irons. The real Earl of Warwick's implicated in the whole conspiracy thing. So, Edmund must have thought that London is just too hot. So he flees across the Channel. And I think that he had no intention of rebelling at this point, because he doesn't go to Margaret of Burgundy like his brother did. He was still alive. She's still in Mechlin. She's still very wealthy. She could easily have and she has financed Warbeck. So instead, Edmund goes to stay with Sir James Tyrrell, who, students of this period, the name will be familiar, as he's the guy who's supposed to have arranged for the murder of the princes in the Tower. But that's, of course, is a whole different story. So, but this time, Tyrrell's captain of Guisnes, which is one of the fortresses guarding Calais, and so Edmund finds sanctuary there.
Despite this, he does eventually make his way back into England and into court circles, but then in August 1501, he leaves England again without approval from Henry VII. So why? What has changed by the time we get to August 1501?
So again, basically, the humiliations continue. And the more Henry tries to sort of yoke Edmund to the Tudor cart, the more resentment it's creating. And the last straw is when Henry goes to Calais to hold a very important diplomatic conference with the Archduke of Burgundy, Philip of Habsburg, who's the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is all tied in with the marriage of Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's eldest son, to Catherine of Aragon. And it just happens that Philip of Habsburg, Duke of Burgundy, is married to Catherine of Aragon's sister, Joanna of Castile. So it's this is a big diplomatic bun fight. And once again, Henry takes all the important nobles with him to Calais to present a united front to the Habsburgs. And again, we have to remember this is still in the background of the Warbeck affair. And Ferdinand of Aragon has told Henry he's not letting his daughter, Catherine, marry Arthur so long as there's any Yorkists knocking around to cause trouble. So Edmund then becomes this chief feature of this diplomatic summit. He's put on parade almost. And the various trade deals are discussed and all the rest of it. And it ends up with Henry right at the end. He says, Philip, I've got a surprise for you. You're a keen jouster, aren't you? And he was. And so I'm going to hold this fantastic tournament. It's going to be the like you've never seen before anywhere in Europe. You're going to be guest of honour. And I'm going to have Edmund de la Pole. He's going to be there. You know, he's a good jouster. It's going to be great. And he makes Edmund swear as part of the whole chivalry, the routine for the joust is, you have to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. And Edmund is in front of the whole of the English court and all the diplomats of Europe. Edmund has to swear loyalty to the Tudor crown. And then Henry writes all this down in letters and sends them all off to the crowned heads of Europe, detailing Edmund's oath of loyalty. So at this point, there's a very shady figure sort of wanders into the frame, and this is a chap called Sir Robert Curzon. Now, there's, again, a lot of, go into more detail in the book, but Curzon's motives are highly debatable. There's some evidence that he was, in fact, a Tudor spy and agent provocateur. Anyway, we'll leave his motives aside at one point, but he basically suggests to Edmund that he can secure the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor for a Yorkist restoration, which, of course, this was Maximilian, and he had, of course, backed Warbeck up to a point and Simnel up to a point, and so on. And so Curzon suggests, if you can make it to the imperial court, I can arrange imperial support. And Curzon at this time, he had been captain of Hams, which is the next door castle to Guines, and he'd petitioned the king to go and fight a crusade in the east with the imperial army. So he already had an entree into Maximilian's court. He'd been made a baron of the empire, so he presents a very, very appealing case to Edmund, and Edmund falls for it. And this time he really does have rebellion on his mind when he flees England, and he also takes with him his brother, his youngest brother Richard. He goes with him, and their servant steward, Sir Thomas Killingworth.
So is it at this point that we can see that he is now actively plotting a return to England, hoping to oust the Tudors, or is he just discussing things with people? Is there an active?
Yeah, he's absolutely has rebellion in his mind now. There are letters and documents in the archives that he goes. He takes a while for him to track Maximilian down because the emperor's wandering around the Alps. This is high summer, and he's going on hunting trips. And every time Edmund rocks up at a village, and the local dignitary says, "Oh no, the emperor! Oh, you should have been here yesterday. The emperor's moved on. He's hunting somewhere else."
Just missed him.
Yeah, exactly. But anyways, so he does eventually catch up with them, and he has an audience, and Maximilian says, yes, if I had one of Edward's blood, I will spare nothing. No, all my money will be spent on restoring him to the throne. And Edmund claims he had to flee England because Henry was plotting his murder, and his only course of action was to make a bid for the throne, which is classic rebel speak.
While outside of England, it's at this point that Edmund is being spoken of as the White Rose, the York's chief claimant to the throne. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence that in this period when he is beginning to plot, when he is planning a return to England, is he in communication with the other notable White Rose families, such as Margaret Pole as the head of the Pole family? You've got the Lyles, you've got the Courtenays. Do we have any insight as to whether he was actually speaking to them as well?
No, there's nothing I've come across, letters certainly not to Margaret Pole or the Lyles. Courtenay, he was in touch with. He held a dinner party, which is probably a council of war, just before he left, and Courtenay was definitely there. But Courtenay was very quickly neutralised by Henry. He was shipped off to the Tower. So Margaret Pole, again, she'd been neutralised highly effectively by marrying her to the Welsh knight. She was a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon, wasn't she? Mm. And she Margaret, you know this subject far better than I do, but she, as far as I'm aware, she's had no signs of rebelling or had no interest in
No,
playing
not at all.
this game of politics. And so yeah, the people Edmund are dealing with more and more are the ragtag and bobtail of the Yorkist cause.
Got it.
I mean, perhaps indicative is Sir George Neville, not the Baron Bergeveni and the famous Nevilles. He was very much a soldier of fortune who'd fought for Warbeck, and I think he'd been pardoned about 3 times by the end, and he ends up as sort of Edmund's chief of staff. But he was an illegitimate son, so that was about as important on the English side of things that Edmund was able to recruit. So yeah, the Yorkists back in England seem to have the noble Yorkists seem to have no interest in him at all.
And in 1502, everything changes for Edmund because Henry VII is able to conclude a treaty with the Holy Roman Emperor. So what then happens to Edmund?
Yes, so again, Maximilian, fascinating person. I mean, you couldn't trust him as far as you could throw him. He was, he'd sign treaties and he'd just not implicate them. I mean, that this one in particular, Henry offered him £10,000 for his crusade, though he actually used it to finance an attack on Milan. And if he sent Edmund back, and Maximilian took the money, but did nothing. So he knew full well, how important Edmund was as a lever over Henry. So Edmund's packed off to Aachen, which was technically a free city within the Holy Roman Empire, and so it had a huge amount of autonomy. And it was a haven for all manner of sort of refugees at this point. So Maximilian tells Edmund, right, set up shop there. I'll pay your bills for you, and he stays there for basically the next 4 years. But increasingly, when Maximilian needs to annoy the English, Edmund is promised men and money to launch an invasion. And when Maximilian wants good relations with Tudor England, the money dries up. So Edmund's situation, and Richard's, gets steady worse and worse and worse as they end up owing money right, left, and centre to creditors. There's various letters from Maximilian saying, "Oh yeah, don't worry, I'll pay your bills," and the money never arrives, and it's stolen, and so yes, by sort of 1504-5, they're in a pretty parlous state.
I'm going to ask you actually as this is all going on, what is happening to Edmund's brothers back in England? I mean, based on what you just said, they're being punished kind of by osmosis.
Yes. So Richard, the youngest brother, was with Edmund in Aachen. But there were two other brothers, Humphrey, who was a priest, and he was, again, we know very, very little about him except he did hold a couple of offices at St Paul's Cathedral and ended up as a rural parson. But the other brother, William, he he married a wealthy heiress, and it was actually she who set her cap at him. And there's a wonderful letter from a Venetian ambassador, I think, saying that William was happy to waste the flower of his youth, knowing that in the fullness of time he'd inherit the widow's fortune. So, but sadly, it didn't do any good, because the moment Edmund does this moonlight flit, William is thrown in the tower. And so none of the wealthy widow did nothing to help him. So, poor William de la Pole, he has the dubious distinction of being the Tower's longest serving prisoner. He was there for 37 years, and he didn't die till 1539, having never seen the light of day.
In 1506, Edmund is surrendered to Henry VII, but on a condition that his life is spared. So what happened to him at this point?
Yeah, I mean, poor Edmund, he honestly thought that he could make a deal. And again, there's a very, very long, lengthy document from Edmund sort of, it is couched in very grand, diplomatic, regal language. He refers to himself, with the royal we and this sort of thing, saying that, yes,
Hmm.
I realise now that my cause maybe isn't what it should be, and I'm quite happy to relinquish the crown, blah, 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 blah. But it's too late. I mean, the deal was done because, again, it gets it's explained in the book in a bit more detail. But to cut the story short, Edmund finds himself a prisoner of Archduke Philip of Habsburg, who his wife was the sister of Catherine of Aragon, and
Hmm.
Philip, because his wife had a claim to the throne of Castile, Philip wanted to seize Castile and Aragon for himself. So he sets off with a huge armada from the Netherlands uh, to Spain to seize the crown. And he gets shipwrecked off the coast of Devon and Cornwall, and Dorset. And so he's all his ships managed to find safe havens, and his courtiers tell him, for God's sake, don't go ashore. This is England. We're not the best popular people here. So, but he ignores them and he goes ashore. And of course, he's immediately sort of welcomed as a guest slash taken prisoner, and sent off to Henry in London. And of course, Henry welcomes him again as an honoured guest, and my cousin this and my cousin that, and there's feasts and jousts and blah 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 blah. But it's quite clear he's a prisoner, and he's going nowhere until he relinquishes Edmund de la Pole. And so they do a deal, and Philip is allowed to go on his way, but not until Edmund arrives back in England, which he
Hmm.
does in 1506. And he's again put right to the last. Edmund thinks he's going to get all his lands and titles back, and he's sort of paraded through London, not in the same way Warbeck was, to be exposed to jeers and things, but he suddenly realizes, oh my God, we're heading towards the tower, and that's it.
Yeah.
The next thing you know is the door slammed shut behind him, and he's there incarcerated with his brother.
So in 1509, Henry VII dies. His son, Prince Henry, ascends the throne as Henry VIII. A few years later, Edmund is still in prison, but Richard, his younger brother, he throws his lot in with the French king. Why?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Richard had been wooed by the French for quite some time. There's evidence as far back as 1504 when Richard was sent by his brother on a diplomatic mission to Hungary, where their cousin just happened to be queen, to try and enlist, Hungarian support. And whilst there, there was contact made with the French, definitely. And over the years, obviously, Richard saw how the Habsburgs had treated himself and his brother, and they were just completely untrustworthy. And so by 1510, he makes his final attempt
Mm.
to woo the emperor to his cause. And it's Christmas 1510, and he makes a journey through the snowy Alps to the Black Forest city of Freiburg, where the emperor is holding Christmas, and he gets short shrift, basically. So he does go back to
Right.
Hungary for a while, and there the French envoys, make contact again, and he basically accepts their offer of asylum. And again, the French king, by this time it's Louis XII, had also realised the importance of having a Yorkist pretender to. It's a phrase actually used by Philip of Habsburg that he can be the bit in the horse's mouth to keep the King of England on the straight and narrow. But yeah, so Richard his importance as a pawn is appreciated. So he pops up again in 1512, and by this time again the balance of power has shifted because England has made common cause with Ferdinand of Aragon, who
Mm.
probably poisoned his son-in-law and to end this attempt to steal the throne of Castile from under his nose. So Ferdinand was now sort of king and technically regent for Castile. That's another story. And Ferdinand had made an alliance with Henry VII. And so, you had a pretty serious power block on northern and southern France. And Henry had declared in his coronation oath that he was going to recover the lost lands of the Plantagenets in Normandy and Gascony. And he'd launched, he was plotting a campaign with Ferdinand to invade southern France. Louis responded by saying, right, well, I'll depose you and put Richard on the throne. I mean, how serious he was is anybody's guess. But he certainly made the announcement that he recognised Richard's right to rule.
So this obviously ends up being utterly catastrophic for poor Edmund back in London.
Yeah.
He's imprisoned in the Tower of London, has been for 7 years. What does Henry VIII do?
Well, he does what Henry VIII always does. Poor Edmund goes to the block. But to be fair to Henry, Henry VII had put in his will a coda saying that Edmund should be killed. He said, I've made this deal with Philip of Habsburg not to have Edmund executed, but you're not subject to that deal. You can do what you like. So, if I were you, I'm not saying you should, but if I were you, I'd have him killed because, that will mean the Tudors are secure on the throne. But Henry doesn't do this, though he pardons a lot of ex-Yorkists that had backed Edmund up to a point, like Courtney, I think was one of them. But he keeps Edmund in the Tower. But when the sequence of events isn't quite clear, but certainly the campaign to invade Gascony, southern France, fails. So Henry decides to try again in northern France, but it becomes quite clear that he can't leave a rebel, even one under lock and key, in case, they try and rescue him. And now the French have backed Richard, then the only safe course of action for him is to have poor Edmund killed. I mean, it's odd that he doesn't have William executed at the same time, I always think, because, William was the older boy. And, a man by this time, of course. So in theory, the claim should have passed to William. So, but William, again, was probably, not quite kingly material, shall we say. And whereas Richard definitely was, he seemed to be a very astute politician and a very capable military commander. So Richard was a real threat.
I think it was probably as well with Henry VIII. There was probably a bit of spite in there as well. Like, had he been able to, I think, had he got hold of Richard, then maybe Edmund's life might have been spared. It's similar when we get much later to the decision that he makes to execute Margaret Pole. I actually believe that this was driven from spite, and that had he been able to get hold of Reginald Pole, that Margaret would have been spared. I think his decision to execute her was spite. It was, I can't get to you, Reginald. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hit you where it hurts. And maybe there's something going on there as well with Edmund and Richard. And had Richard been captured, things might have been easier for Edmund, maybe.
That's a brilliant analogy. Yes, as you say, the whole Reginald thing and the letters he wrote sort of signed his mother's death warrant.
Pretty much, yes. So with Edmund dead, did Richard then take on the mantle of the White Rose? Is that what he saw himself now as?
Very much so. All the French and other sources refer to him as La Blanche Rose. He also styles himself the fourth Duke of Suffolk. And I think it was Percy Warbeck who actually used the term White Rose as a nom de guerre. And it was definitely picked up by Edmund, and Richard used it to great effect. And even there's a famous painting in I think it's in the Ashmolean. There's two, one in the Leeds Armouries and one in the Ashmolean. And it's showing this Battle of Pavia with Richard right in the thick of the fighting, and underneath it says "Regard the Blanche Rose." So it was definitely a title that everybody knew him by.
He never, as far as I'm aware, he never properly returns to England, and he is killed in 1525. So what became of Richard at the end of his life?
So yes, so without giving too much away, I think he's killed in the Battle of Pavia. heroically, I'd like to say, and yes, he very much is in command of the German mercenaries I was talking about, the Lanzknechts. These are renegades called the Black Band, and yes, this was the last stand of the French infantry. The French king had already been captured, and they were sort of marching to his aid when they were surrounded and shot to pieces because there were Germans who fought for the French. They were loathed by the Germans who fought for the Holy Roman Emperor. So there's no quarter asked or given when the two met in battle. And so they were absolutely slaughtered to a man. And Richard was found under the pile of corpses, and he was buried in an Italian church in the middle of Pavia, which, if you ever get a chance to go, it's one of the glorious little churches of Italy. It's just amazing. And I was lucky enough to go last year. And it's also the two Christian philosophers, St. Augustine and Boethius, are both buried there. So
Right.
It's an incredibly important church, but you'd never know it was there. It's tucked away down a little back street. And so,
As they often are with Italy.
yeah, yes, quite, yes.
I remember being in Rome once, and we got taken into this quite unassuming little church, and just hanging on the wall was an original Caravaggio.
Brilliant.
Just think, okay, sure.
Oh, yes, it hides a nasty stain.
Yeah. So my final question for you then is, with Richard's death, I mean, as you said, his parents, they have 12 children, but with Richard's death, is this the extinction of the Delapoles? Were they therefore the first of the major York families to effectively leave the party?
In the male line, yes. Edmund did have a daughter. She, after his escape, she became a nun and didn't have children. And they were all buried in the Abbey of the Poor Clares, I think. And Humphrey became a priest. He didn't have a son. None of the other Delapoles had any surviving children, with the exception of Richard, who did have a daughter. And she was obviously illegitimate because the mother was married to somebody else, but the daughter certainly survived and grew up, and she has descendants who has descendants who has descendants. She actually a lady in waiting to the Queen of Navarre, who was the King of France's sister, and she lived out her life in southwest France, and her descendants actually became important Protestants. And so yeah, there are descendants in the female lines still in the Pyrenees.
Yeah, but the name itself went extinct, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right, I see. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and having this discussion. It's been really fascinating. As we said at the start, the book is now out. Are you able to say what you're working on next at all?
I think so. Yes, I'm hopefully looking at a biography of Sir James Tyrrell. As I say, got a brief mention as the castle where Edmund first sought refuge. So again, he's another of these people who's quite often overlooked. His name is fairly infamous thanks to Sir Thomas More and people. But so I think there's a story to be told there.
Yes, I assume then you're going to be digging into was he, wasn't he? Part of that book.
Yeah, that minefield.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast, and perhaps we'll speak again at some point in the future. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Richard for coming onto the podcast, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. Next week, I am sticking with members of the White Rose Network who ruffled considerable feathers at the Tudor court, as I talk to historian Helen Hyde all about Reginald Pole, the troublesome cardinal son of Margaret Pole, who would go on to become one of the most important men in the life of Queen Mary I. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes or guests, please do drop me a message via Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.